Hello guys, welcome to Folktales where interesting stories are told. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, share with your friends, and don't forget to share your perspectives in the comments section below. Sarah Martinez had always been the type of woman who saw the best in people, sometimes to her own detriment. Living in her cozy two-bedroom apartment in downtown Phoenix, she worked as a marketing coordinator for a local tech startup, barely making ends meet but content with her simple life. Her mother, Elena, lived just 20 minutes away in the house where Sarah had grown up, a modest ranch-style home with a garden that Elena tended with the same fierce devotion she had once given to raising her daughter alone. The tension between Elena and Sarah's husband Marcus had been palpable from their very first meeting 3 years ago. Marcus Chin was undeniably charming, with his perfectly styled hair and designer clothes that somehow always looked effortless. He worked in sales for a luxury car dealership and had a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Everyone except Elena. "There's something about his eyes, Mija," Elena would whisper to Sarah during their weekly coffee dates at the little cafe near her house. "They don't smile when his mouth does. A man who truly loves you doesn't calculate every word before he speaks it." Sarah would laugh it off, attributing her mother's concerns to overprotectiveness. After all, Elena had raised her as a single mother after Sarah's father left when she was just 5 years old. It made sense that she'd be suspicious of any man who wanted to marry her daughter. But Elena's observations were more specific than general maternal worry. She noticed how Marcus's attention seemed to wander whenever Sarah talked about her modest salary, how his eyes would light up only when the conversation turned to Elena's successful catering business or the valuable antiques she'd inherited from Sarah's grandmother. During family dinners, Marcus would steer conversations toward Elena's investments, her property, her retirement plans, topics that made Sarah uncomfortable but that Marcus pursued with the persistence of a detective. "He asks too many questions about money for someone who claims to love you for who you are," Elena told Sarah one autumn evening as they walked through the neighborhood where Sarah had learned to ride her bike. The leaves crunched under their feet, and Sarah could smell the familiar scent of Elena's lavender perfume mixed with the crisp desert air. "When your father left us, I learned to recognize the signs of a man who sees dollar signs instead of a woman's heart." Sarah defended Marcus passionately, pointing out his romantic gestures, the surprise weekend trips to Sedona, the expensive jewelry he bought her for their anniversary, the way he'd sweep her off to fancy restaurants she could never afford on her own salary. But Elena remained unmoved. "A man who truly loves you doesn't need to prove it with money he doesn't have," she said quietly. "And a man who truly loves you doesn't make you feel guilty for not having more to give him." The arguments between mother and daughter became more frequent as Sarah's marriage to Marcus grew more strained. Marcus complained that Elena was poisoning Sarah against him, that her mother was jealous of their happiness and trying to sabotage their relationship. He began suggesting they move to another city, somewhere they could start fresh away from Elena's negative influence. Sarah found herself caught between the two most important people in her life, feeling torn and exhausted by the constant tension. Elena's health began declining that winter, though she tried to hide it from Sarah. She'd been battling diabetes for years, but now she seemed more tired, more fragile. During their coffee dates, Sarah noticed her mother's hands shaking slightly as she lifted her cup, saw how she'd paused to catch her breath after climbing the cafe's front steps. When Sarah expressed concern, Elena would wave her off with a smile. "I'm fine, Mija. I just want to make sure you're going to be okay when I'm not here to look out for you anymore." Those words haunted Sarah more than she cared to admit. The idea of losing her mother felt impossible, unthinkable. Elena had been her anchor through every storm, her biggest cheerleader through every triumph, her wisest counselor through every difficult decision. The thought of navigating life without her mother's guidance terrified Sarah, especially as her marriage continued to deteriorate and Marcus became increasingly distant and irritable. As winter turned to spring, Elena's warnings about Marcus became more urgent, though she tried to deliver them gently. "Promise me something, Sarah? she said one afternoon as they sat in her garden, watching the desert wildflowers bloom. "Promise me that if something happens to me, you'll be very careful about who you trust. Money changes people, and sometimes it reveals who they really were all along." Sarah promised, though she didn't fully understand why her mother seemed so worried about something that felt so hypothetical. Elena's decline happened faster than anyone expected. What started as fatigue and occasional dizzy spells escalated into a serious diabetic crisis that landed her in the hospital on a rainy Tuesday morning in April. Sarah received the call at work and rushed to the medical center, her heart pounding as she navigated through Phoenix traffic that seemed unusually heavy. When she arrived, Elena was conscious but weak, her usually vibrant complexion pale against the stark white hospital sheets. For the next 2 weeks, Sarah practically lived at the hospital, taking time off work to be by her mother's side. She held Elena's hand through the difficult nights, helped her with meals when she was strong enough to eat, and listened to stories about her childhood that Elena seemed desperate to share. It was during these quiet hospital hours that Elena's warnings about Marcus took on a different tone, less urgent, more like gentle advice from someone who knew their time was running short. Marcus's behavior during this period surprised everyone, including Sarah. The man who had previously found excuses to avoid family gatherings and had always seemed uncomfortable around Elena suddenly became the most attentive son-in-law imaginable. He brought Elena her favorite flowers, bright yellow sunflowers that reminded her of her garden, and sat patiently by her bedside, listening to her stories with what appeared to be genuine interest. He coordinated with Sarah's work to ensure she could take extended leave, handled the insurance paperwork with the hospital, and even researched the best specialists in the area. "Maybe I was wrong about him," Elena whispered to Sarah one evening as Marcus stepped out to get them coffee from the hospital cafeteria. Her voice was weaker now, but her eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had guided Sarah through so many difficult decisions. "He's been so kind, so helpful. Perhaps I let my own fears cloud my judgment." Sarah felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, this crisis would bring her family together and heal the rift that had caused her so much pain. When Elena passed away peacefully on a Thursday morning, with Sarah holding one hand and Marcus holding the other, Sarah felt like her world had collapsed. The woman who had been her constant source of strength and wisdom was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt deafening. Marcus stepped up in ways that Sarah had never seen before, handling the funeral arrangements with efficiency and compassion that touched everyone who witnessed it. He coordinated with the funeral home, selected a beautiful casket that honored Elena's simple but elegant taste, and even helped Sarah choose the perfect dress for her mother, a navy blue outfit that Elena had worn to Sarah's college graduation. Marcus contacted Elena's friends from the catering business, organized the reception, and made sure that every detail reflected the dignity and grace that had defined Elena's life. Sarah found herself leaning on him in ways she hadn't in years, grateful for his strength when she felt too broken to make even the simplest decisions. The funeral service was beautiful, held at the small Catholic church where Elena had worshipped for over 20 years. The sanctuary was filled with sunflowers, and the priest spoke about Elena's generous spirit and her devotion to her daughter. Marcus delivered a touching eulogy about how Elena had taught him the meaning of unconditional love through her example, and how he promised to honor her memory by taking better care of Sarah. There wasn't a dry eye in the church, and Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months, the feeling that maybe her marriage could be saved after all. In the weeks following the funeral, Marcus continued to be the supportive husband that Sarah had always hoped he could be. He helped her sort through Elena's belongings, a task that felt overwhelming in her grief. Together, they packed up Elena's clothes for donation, carefully wrapped her collection of vintage dishes, and decided which pieces of furniture Sarah wanted to keep. Marcus was patient when Sarah broke down crying over a recipe card written in Elena's handwriting, and he held her when she found the box of letters Elena had saved from Sarah's childhood. He also handled the practical matters that Sarah felt too emotionally drained to deal with, contacting Elena's lawyer about the will, organizing the paperwork for the house sale, and managing the various accounts and investments that Elena had accumulated over her lifetime. Sarah was touched by his attention to detail and his gentle way of handling her mother's affairs. For the first time in their marriage, she felt like they were truly partners, working together through a difficult situation. Marcus even suggested they take a weekend trip to Sedona, the place where they'd had their honeymoon, to help Sarah process her grief and reconnect as a couple. They stayed at the same bed and breakfast where they'd spent their first married weekend, and Marcus was attentive and loving in ways that reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. He listened patiently as she shared memories of her mother, held her when she cried, and made her laugh with gentle jokes about Elena's stubborn streak and her legendary cooking disasters. "I know your mother, and I didn't always see eye to eye," Marcus said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the red rocks in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "But I want you to know that I respected her love for you, and I promised to spend the rest of our marriage proving that I'm worthy of the trust she placed in me." Sarah felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time since Elena's death, believing that maybe her mother's passing had somehow brought out the best in her husband and given their marriage a second chance. The call from Elena's attorney came on a Wednesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the funeral. Sarah was sitting at her kitchen table, still in her pajamas, trying to summon the energy to get ready for work when her phone rang. Mr. Rodriguez had been Elena's lawyer for over 15 years, handling everything from her business contracts to her estate planning. And his voice carried a mixture of professional formality and genuine warmth as he asked Sarah to come to his office that afternoon to discuss her mother's will. Sarah had assumed the meeting would be straightforward: Elena's modest house, her small savings account, maybe some jewelry and family heirlooms. She knew her mother had been careful with money, running a successful catering business for nearly 2 decades, but Elena had always lived simply, driving the same Honda Civic for 10 years and shopping at discount stores despite her business success. Sarah expected maybe enough to help with the funeral expenses and perhaps a small nest egg to ease her financial stress. Marcus insisted on accompanying her to the lawyer's office, which was located in a professional building in downtown Phoenix. He held her hand in the elevator and squeezed it reassuringly as they walked down the carpeted hallway to Mr. Rodriguez's suite. The office was warm and inviting, with family photos on the desk and certificates covering one wall. Mr. Rodriguez, a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, greeted them both with genuine sympathy. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he began, settling behind his mahogany desk with Elena's file spread before him. "She was incredibly thoughtful about her estate planning, and she wanted to make sure you were well taken care of, Sarah." He opened the folder and began reading from the official documents, his voice steady and professional as he outlined the various bequests: the house, the car, some jewelry, and Elena's business equipment. Then came the surprise that changed everything. Additionally, Mr. Rodriguez continued, "Your mother maintained several investment accounts and a life insurance policy that she funded consistently over the past 20 years. The total value of these assets, after taxes and fees, comes to approximately $680,000. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, and Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as she tried to process what she just heard. Marcus's hand tightened on hers. But when she looked at him, she saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify, a flash of something that looked almost like excitement before his face settled into appropriate surprise and concern for her emotional state. That's incredible," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "Elena was obviously much more successful than any of us realized. Sarah, this changes everything for us." The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as they navigated the familiar streets of their neighborhood. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of her inheritance, but also deeply moved by her mother's foresight and sacrifice. Elena had lived modestly not because she had to, but because she was building something for Sarah's future. The weight of that love and planning felt both comforting and overwhelming. That evening, as they sat in their small living room with takeout containers scattered on the coffee table, Marcus began talking about possibilities. His enthusiasm was infectious. At first he spoke about paying off their credit card debt, maybe getting a bigger apartment, taking the European vacation they'd always talked about but never been able to afford. Sarah found herself caught up in his excitement, imagining a life free from the financial stress that had been a constant companion throughout their marriage. But as the days passed, Marcus's suggestions became more elaborate and expensive. He researched luxury cars online, showing Sarah pictures of BMWs and Mercedes that cost more than she made in 2 years. He talked about buying a house in Scottsdale, one of Phoenix's most exclusive neighborhoods, with a pool and a 3-car garage. He suggested they quit their jobs and travel the world for a year, staying in 5-star hotels and eating at Michelin-starred restaurants. "We could finally live the life we deserve," Marcus said one evening as he scrolled through real estate listings on his laptop. "Your mother would want you to enjoy this money, not just let it sit in some boring savings account." But something about his tone made Sarah uncomfortable. There was an urgency in his voice that reminded her of a salesman closing a deal, and she found herself thinking about Elena's warnings about people who saw dollar signs instead of hearts. Sarah suggested they take time to think about their options, maybe meet with a financial advisor to discuss long-term planning and investment strategies. She wanted to honor her mother's sacrifice by being responsible with the inheritance, perhaps using some of it to further her education or start a small business. But Marcus seemed impatient with her cautious approach, dismissing her concerns as unnecessary worry. "You're overthinking this, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration that she hadn't heard since before Elena's death. "This is our chance to finally have everything we've ever wanted. Why are you being so hesitant?" When she mentioned wanting to save most of the money for their future, maybe for children or retirement, Marcus's expression darkened in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of their arguments before her mother's illness. The shift in Marcus's behavior was subtle at first, but it became more pronounced as Sarah continued to resist his spending suggestions. The patient, supportive husband who had held her through her grief began to disappear, replaced by someone who seemed increasingly focused on the money and frustrated by Sarah's reluctance to spend it immediately. The warmth that had rekindled between them after Elena's death began to cool, and Sarah found herself wondering if her mother's concerns about Marcus had been more accurate than she'd wanted to believe. The transformation in Marcus was gradual but undeniable. What had started as enthusiastic suggestions about their newfound financial freedom slowly morphed into persistent pressure that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. He began bringing home brochures for expensive cars, leaving real estate listings on her nightstand, and making comments about how they were wasting the inheritance by not using it immediately. The gentle, supportive husband who had comforted her through Elena's death seemed to evaporate, replaced by someone Sarah barely recognized. Their conversations became tense and circular, with Marcus growing more frustrated each time Sarah suggested they should be conservative with the money. "Your mother didn't save all that money for you to be afraid of it," he would argue, his voice taking on a sharp edge that made Sarah's stomach clench. "She would want us to be happy, to live well. What's the point of having money if we're going to act like we're still broke?" But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with his reasoning, that the man she'd married wouldn't be so fixated on spending money that wasn't even technically his. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late June. Marcus had made an appointment to look at a house in Paradise Valley, one of Phoenix's most exclusive neighborhoods, without consulting Sarah first. The house was listed at $850,000, well beyond what even their inheritance could comfortably afford, especially considering they'd need to maintain their current jobs to pay the mortgage and upkeep. When Sarah expressed concern about the financial commitment, Marcus exploded in a way that shocked her with its intensity. "I'm tired of your excuses, Sarah," he shouted, his face flushed with anger. "We finally have a chance to live like normal people instead of scraping by paycheck to paycheck, and you want to keep us trapped in this tiny apartment forever. Maybe your mother was right to worry about you. You don't have the backbone to take advantage of opportunities when they're handed to you." The cruelty of his words, especially the reference to Elena, cut Sarah deeper than any argument they'd ever had. That night, Marcus slept on the couch, and the next morning he announced that he needed space to think about their relationship. He moved in with his brother temporarily, claiming that Sarah's financial paranoia was making it impossible for him to envision their future. Supportive during her mother's illness, was now abandoning her during another difficult period. All because she wouldn't immediately spend the inheritance on his wishes. Alone in their apartment for the first time since Elena's death, Sarah found herself thinking about her mother's warnings with new clarity. She remembered Elena's observations about Marcus's interest in money, his questions about investments and property values, his discomfort with their modest lifestyle. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't wanted to see began falling into place, creating a picture that made her feel sick to her stomach. 2 weeks into their separation, Marcus called to suggest they make it permanent. His voice was cold and businesslike, nothing like the warm tone he'd used during Elena's final days. "I think we want different things from life," he said, as if their 3-year marriage was simply a business partnership that wasn't working out. "Maybe it's better if we both move on and find people who are more compatible with our goals." The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, and when Sarah hung up, she felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and relief. That evening, Sarah decided to review Elena's will more carefully. She'd been so overwhelmed by the inheritance amount during the initial meeting with Mr. Rodriguez that she hadn't paid attention to the specific terms and conditions. She spread the legal documents across her kitchen table, reading through the formal language with growing amazement at her mother's foresight and wisdom. Buried in the middle of the document was a clause that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The inheritance was structured so that Sarah would only receive the full amount if she was unmarried at the time of Elena's death or if she divorced within 6 months of Elena's passing. If she remained married, the money would be held in trust with only the interest available to her, and Marcus would have no legal claim to any portion of the inheritance regardless of their marital status. Sarah read the clause 3 times, her hands shaking as the implications became clear. Elena had somehow anticipated exactly what would happen, that Marcus's true nature would reveal itself when money entered the picture, and that Sarah would need protection from his greed. Her mother had structured the inheritance not just to provide for Sarah's future, but to expose Marcus's real motivations and give Sarah a way out of a marriage built on false pretenses. The next morning, Sarah called Mr. Rodriguez to confirm her understanding of the will's terms. "Your mother was very specific about this provision," he explained gently. "She said she wanted to make sure that anyone who married you for the right reasons would support your decision to be cautious with the inheritance, while anyone with ulterior motives would reveal themselves when faced with the choice between love and money." Elena had been protecting her daughter even from beyond the grave, using her final gift to expose the truth about Marcus's character. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in months. She called Marcus that afternoon and asked him to meet her at a coffee shop near their old apartment. When he arrived, looking hopeful that she might have changed her mind about the money, Sarah calmly explained what she'd discovered in the will. She watched his face change as she described the inheritance clause, saw the exact moment when he realized that his plan to access Elena's money through their marriage had been doomed from the start. "So you knew," Marcus said finally, his voice flat and defeated. "You knew the whole time that I couldn't touch the money, and you let me make a fool of myself." Sarah shook her head, explaining that she'd only discovered the clause after he'd already asked for separation. But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. His mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating stranger who had been hiding behind the facade of a loving husband. "Your mother was a manipulative old woman," he said bitterly, "and you're just like her. I wasted 3 years of my life on someone who was never going to give me what I deserved." With those words, he stood up and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Sarah alone with her coffee and the devastating confirmation of everything Elena had tried to warn her about. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly once Marcus realized he had no claim to Elena's inheritance. What Sarah had expected to be a bitter, drawn-out legal battle turned into a surprisingly straightforward process when Marcus discovered that fighting would only cost him money he didn't have for a prize he could never win. His lawyer advised him that Elena's will was ironclad, and any attempt to contest it would likely result in expensive legal fees with no chance of success. Within 3 months, Sarah found herself officially single and in possession of the inheritance her mother had so carefully protected. The first thing Sarah did with her newfound freedom was quit her stressful job at the tech startup. She'd been working 60-hour weeks in a toxic environment, constantly worried about making ends meet and dealing with a boss who treated his employees like disposable resources. Walking into that office for the last time, carrying a box of her personal belongings, felt like shedding a skin that had never quite fit. Her coworkers looked at her with a mixture of envy and admiration as she explained that she was starting her own freelance marketing consultancy, finally pursuing the dream she'd talked about for years but never had the financial security to attempt. Sarah used a portion of the inheritance to purchase a charming 2-bedroom house in the same neighborhood where Elena had lived, just 3 blocks from her childhood home. The house had a small garden that reminded her of her mother's, with space for the sunflowers that Elena had loved so much. She spent weekends painting the walls in warm, welcoming colors and arranging Elena's furniture throughout the rooms, creating a space that honored her mother's memory while reflecting her own personality and dreams. Her freelance business flourished in ways that surprised even her optimistic projections. Working from her home office, surrounded by Elena's books and family photos, Sarah discovered that she had a natural talent for helping small businesses tell their stories and connect with their customers. Her client base grew through word-of-mouth referrals, and she found herself earning more money working 30 hours a week than she'd ever made in her corporate job. The financial security provided by Elena's inheritance gave her the confidence to be selective about her clients, working only with businesses whose values aligned with her own. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Sarah fulfilled a dream that she and Elena had shared for years: a trip to Italy. They had planned to go together for Elena's 70th birthday, spending 2 weeks exploring the small towns of Tuscany and sampling the regional cuisine that had inspired Elena's catering business. Sarah traveled alone but carried Elena's spirit with her, visiting the cooking schools in Bologna that her mother had researched, touring the vineyards of Chianti that Elena had dreamed of seeing, and eating gelato in the piazzas of Florence while imagining her mother's delight at the flavors and textures. In a small restaurant in Siena, Sarah met Antonio, a local chef who spoke passionate English about the importance of preserving traditional recipes and family food traditions. Their conversation lasted hours, flowing from cooking techniques to family stories to dreams for the future. Antonio reminded Sarah that food was about more than sustenance; it was about love, memory, and connection. When he invited her to extend her stay and learn some traditional Tuscan recipes, Sarah surprised herself by saying yes, using her flexible schedule and financial freedom to embrace an opportunity that would have been impossible in her old life. Returning to Phoenix after 3 weeks in Italy, Sarah felt transformed in ways that went far beyond her tan and the Italian phrases she'd learned. She had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried under years of financial stress and an unhappy marriage. She started volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic marketing skills to women starting their own businesses, finding deep satisfaction in helping others achieve the independence she had fought so hard to attain. Dating again felt strange at first, but Sarah approached it with the wisdom Elena had tried to impart, paying attention to actions rather than words, noticing how potential partners treated service workers and talked about money, observing whether they seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams or just impressed by her financial stability. She dated thoughtfully and selectively, never rushing into anything serious, but enjoying the process of meeting new people and discovering what she truly wanted in a partner. On the first anniversary of Elena's death, Sarah planted a garden of sunflowers in her backyard, creating a living memorial to her mother's love and wisdom. As she knelt in the rich desert soil, her hands dirty and her heart full, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for Elena's foresight and protection. Her mother had given her more than money; she had given her the tools to recognize true love from false promises, the courage to choose her own path, and the security to build a life based on her own values rather than someone else's expectations. Sarah's story became one she shared carefully with the women in her volunteer groups, a cautionary tale about the importance of financial independence and the wisdom of listening to the people who love us unconditionally. She had learned that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is not just love and support, but the hard-won wisdom to recognize when someone doesn't deserve either. Elena's inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about freedom, dignity, and the chance to build a life worthy of the sacrifices made by the woman who had loved her most. Standing in her sunflower garden as the Arizona sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Sarah felt her mother's presence in the warm evening breeze and knew that Elena's greatest wish had been fulfilled. Her daughter was finally, truly happy and free. Moral lesson: Sarah's journey teaches us that true love protects rather than exploits, and that sometimes the people who care about us most can see dangers we're blind to ourselves. Elena's wisdom reminds us that financial security isn't just about money, it's about the freedom to make choices based on love rather than fear, and the power to recognize our own worth. In a world where relationships can be complicated by material concerns, Sarah's story encourages us to value the voices of those who love us unconditionally and to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even when we desperately want it to be right. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to Folktales for more inspiring stories about love, family, and finding your way through life's challenges. Share this with friends who might need to hear Sarah's message, and let us know in the comments what lessons you've learned from the wise women in your own life. Your perspectives and experiences help build our community of storytellers and dreamers.